So South Africa is now pushing for the African Union to get a seat at the G20 as leaders from the world's top economies gathered yesterday and today in Indonesia for their annual meetings. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is attending the G20 meeting, wants the collective voice of the continent to be represented. The African Union chairman and the president of Senegal, Macky Sall, is also in attendance in Bali and wants an overhaul of international governance and asks greater African representations on bodies such as the United Nations Security Council and the G20. Joining me from Kampala to chat today's tonight is international journalist and political economist Joseph Ochieno. Good evening. It's good to see you again on the program tonight. Thank you for coming through, sir. Okay, so let me ask you, what's your view on whether Africa should hold a permanent seat at the G20 at the 20 table?
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's mixed, you know. I am very particular that the permanent seat of the United Nations is long overdue and it's a must that African nations must resolve that they need it and we must have it. And African communities and African citizens, including local African parliaments, should resolve that we must get a permanent seat at the United Nations. It is actually very, very important. That said, then, when it comes to the G20, it's sort of really neither here nor there, simply because G20 constitute 80% of global economies. It is very tempting to say that we need ideally to have a seat there. But to demand when possibly our largest economy is outside that is neither here nor there. In principle, if it is basically saying that 20 of the largest, most powerful economies in the world, unfortunately, we don't appear there. And for that reason, that is an awakening call for African governments and African population that we need to be able to mobilize and organize our resources and our wealth away from corruption, but through building our nation and building our economies. But to consider that the G20 summit is where, you know, the kitchen, sitting room, or dining table of 80% of global economy and global polity takes place is extremely important. So therefore makes absolute sense that this powerful, richest continent in the world should really, by and large, seek a seat there. It's rather smart, actually, considering the money which South Africa is doing, in saying that, look, you know, let it be an AU seat rather than maybe an Egypt seat or a South African seat. Maybe on how it's done, I don't know. Perhaps it means, therefore, that every time that the G20 is sitting, whoever is chairperson of the African Union, the president carrying on the position, like Macky Sall's position this time, is the one who represents Africa there. I think it makes sense, particularly because the argument they've made is very important. Question of climate change, that Africa at the moment, we're paying a huge price for particularly the global north, you know, polluting the world, and we're now paying a price with climate change and with the threats that with which it comes across. And for that reason, I think it's important that we should actually have a seat, you know, regardless of the format of the seat, but have a seat around that table where we're able to have a conversation and demand that the global north particularly pays for polluting and dirtying the world and particularly global Africa.
I'm just trying to find out why it's important for Africa to be on the among the G20. By the way, we can be among the G20 if we have what it takes. But what more does Africa want, and why? When you look at the fact that South Africa is already a member of the G20 bloc.
No, I think, as I said, in a zigzag manner, simply because of the fact that G20 is, if you like, the dining table of 80% of world economics and where the deals are actually cut. It's important that we get represented. And while South Africa is there, South Africa, by and large, it could be argued, are there bilaterally. But if it is African Union, then it is a representation that means that the strategic interest of Africa as a continent, and I was actually attending a regional summit on Africa today somewhere at Makerere University, and I wonder whether if, you know, East Africa, West Africa, ECOWAS cannot speak as one voice, how Africa, as African Union would. But by and large, on this occasion, maybe it might compel the African Union that leading to the G8 summit, maybe African leaders able to have a conversation and say that other than climate change? What are key issues that we're able to put on the table, not only to demand, but to make sure that our voices are heard? But in a way, it is almost like spoiled little children who don't want to participate in doing their homework. By and large, this continent needs to be able to reorganize itself. We need to focus really inward as a continent, to rebuild ourselves, reorganize the economy, to reorganize our polity, to address challenges facing us in terms of insecurity, most of which is actually created by our own bad governance institutions. That really are things that we need to be able to deal with ourselves. Granted, when it comes to the question of climate change, that is not of our making. That's the making of Global North, and indeed a making of the majority of the members of the G8. And if that is the argument, then we have a valid argument to say that, well, Africa actually needs a seat at the G20. Is it the panacea for our growth and development in the future? It is certainly not.
Well, that's what my question, really, my next question, you just took that straight out of my mouth, because I want to know what are the real economic trade and relations benefits if we had the African Union sitting among the G20 biggest economies. His Excellency, President of Senegal, President Macky Sall, has been pushing Africa's role, and I want to say he's been doing quite a good job in recently talking to Russian authorities in the issue of wheat imports to Africa and a few things like that. And he's been moving a lot of needles. So his presidency at the African Union, his chairmanship, seem to be effective. So he's attending as well this G20 for 2022. So do you think he'll be able to move these to get us, Africa, as a union, as a body on the table, so that when things are discussed, we're not just reading the press statement of what has been discussed. He can at least have one voice, at least one vote for 55 countries on the continent in that room, on that table, as an inside man.
I really hope so. And both you and I think on this very same program, thanks to you, we've had this conversation and perhaps actually given credit to President Macky Sall. I have done so in various networks and various spaces to give him credit. It's actually one of those rare credits I give to most African leaders, that actually he's been rather articulate about it. And it's one that has actually touched nerves beyond the African continent. Of course, that said, the irony is that across African capitals, these conversations are not very common about the question of us actually having a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. It's absolutely important that we actually have a seat, because in the likely event that there is a post-Ukraine, Russia, NATO conflict, that Africa is consulted before we begin to be compelled to do part of the cleaning job of a creation, a policy creation, and a geopolitical, geostrategic creation of other people. It's extremely important that we need to be that actually we get this, and for that, particularly as the UN body polity of the world, it is one which is really substantially overdue.
Do we really need to be a member of the G20?
G20, as I say, it's neither here nor there. The UN Security Council, absolutely yes. G20, neither here nor there, except, actually, come to think of it, G20, even if it means that we have an observer status, meaning that we are present anyway, regardless of the voting rights and authorities over that, but that at least when we are there, we make a submission as partners in the same living room, perhaps not necessarily holding the same power, considering with our economic weaknesses, which I said is one of the data for which we need to be able to sort out in our own selves. By and large, yes. But I think going forward, Africa, we will need to sort out our mess and make sure that we begin to bring out much more better press, including better economic indices, for which you're actually perfect in looking through those stock exchange programs on your network. Maybe the more we do that and the figures keep on coming, the more these guys will begin to say that we are not a raw material continent, but if you like, an economic material and economic powers for the future. So we better be able to be sitting next to them.
Yes, well, perhaps it makes sense, because if you look at these members of the G20, we export raw materials on the continent to these same G20 nations, and when we want to borrow money, we borrow from them as well for infrastructure and for everything else. So the trade balance between Africa and the G20 and all of that, we are beholden to them on both sides of the table, to the left and to the right. So I'm trying to understand why we need to be there, and if we need a whole lot more work at home rather than looking for membership.
Bossam, I totally agree with you. And as I said, it's a zigzag conversation you and I are having this evening. I simply say that, well, I am content that if we have this position, but I'm trying to tell you that I would not lose sleep over it, and nor should the continent lose sleep over it. Actually, if there are people demanding for a position in the G20, that because it's that high table, which is the reality of the 80% of the world economies, then it's a wake-up call for us to be able to reorganize and organize the economies and very quickly sort out the challenges heating up our countries. The question of governance, question of leadership, a question of corruption, and make sure that we begin to reinvest in our economies, reinvest in our communities, reinvest in health, reinvest particularly in education. That is what we know will be a guarantee to recreating a new continent that becomes competitive in the next 10, 15 to 20 years. So that, like China did, that perhaps in 20 years' time, we will be not only amongst the G20, but maybe perhaps several nation states, individual nation states in Africa belong to that club. If we don't do that, as you rightly say, it might just be like another cess of flour next to a dining table.
Well, I'm sure you've got dinner. Look at the time. It's about 8:45 in Kampala tonight. So you don't lose your sleep over the G20 seats thing all the time. But if you get it, it's a good thing. We'll give it to Macky Sall and his team. Thank you so much, Joseph Ochieno, international journalist and political economist out of Kampala. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.